This is the 3SB lesson plan. So first off, you have the central focus of the unit, and the central focus stays the same throughout the whole unit for every one of your lesson plans. And so the essential literacy strategy focus is really your main language function. It's what do you want students to be able to comprehend by the end of this unit. And the related skills are the skills that is used to support the strategy right here. The content focus is what you want students to learn, the core concepts that you want them to develop. Next are the standards, and the standards you kind of just list off from either the Common Core or from the NGSS. The instructional learning objectives are what students will be able to do as a result of the lesson, and this is directly aligned to the central focus, the standards, as well as the assessments. And the assessments are used to kind of assess how what students have learned, and they can be informal or formal, and informal can be something that's not collected. It can be like pair shares, and the teacher walks around and kind of listens in to what students are saying, or it can be formal where students are writing something and then turning it in. And then for each instructional learning objective, you need to have an assessment, a form of assessment. Language function is the way that we use language, for what purpose we use language. And so it could be to assess, to explain, to persuade. You need to write down whatever the language function is and apply it to the literacy strategy within the central focus. And it should be coinciding with the objectives. And then you have the additional language demands, and these are demands that are required to achieve the objectives. So this can be things like vocabulary or key phrases, or you can even talk about the syntax or the discourse, which is the kind of writing that you're doing. Next is the resources and materials, and you kind of just list off whatever resources or materials you may need, like a whiteboard, computers, maybe pencils, things like that. The student prior knowledge. This is what students should already know before this lesson, and so you kind of have to take into account what do they know, what can they do, what knowledge they already have based off of what you've taught in the past. So this is really when we're getting into the actual teaching. And here you first off start off with the transition from the previous activity. How are you going to transition from what you taught before to what you're teaching now? And you kind of connect the ideas. And then next for the hook, this is something that is capturing the student's attention, maybe like an image or a video or maybe a quote that kind of gets them interested. Next is the focused instruction, and this is the modeling. This is when you present or teach the content and skills to your students. And so maybe you're lecturing, maybe you're writing something and students are paying attention, or you're modeling how to do a specific activity. Next is the guided instruction or the practice, and kids actually get to practice here. You give them the opportunity to practice what they've just learned in the focused instruction, but they're still getting that the help from the teacher. So the teachers may be walking around and helping students as they fill something out. So then you have independent practice where kids are kind of on their own, and they're working on what they've just learned. They're mastering what they've just learned. And in each of these, there's a differentiating of the scaffolds, which are like further supports for students who may be English learners, have IEPs or 5-4 plans, are struggling readers, underperforming students, or even gifted students. And this is like, how are you going to cater to each of those students and make sure that they're getting the instruction that they need? And then lastly, there's the closure, which is how you're going to bring this activity to a close. It's kind of like the transition that was mentioned here. And this can be in the form of maybe a small discussion. Maybe you bring the class back together and you kind of recap what went well or what you just learned, and kind of maybe close off the activity. So next, I'll be going over a sample lesson plan that somebody else had made. So first is the central focus of the unit, and this is going to stay the same throughout the whole unit. The essential literacy strategy focus is that students will be able to understand the components of good experiment design, discuss and write procedures and protocol, and they'll be able to synthesize and execute an experiment as relates to the effects of mechanical breakdown on the speed of chemical breakdown of food in the digestive system. And then to be able to do this, they need to be able to do these related skills, which is learning the importance of mechanical and chemical breakdown for digestion, for digestion, and then model mechanical and chemical breakdown using Alka-Seltzer tablet and vinegar. They will identify dependent and independent variables designing their experiment, and so by doing this experiment, they're able to understand this concept. Next is the standards, and they kind of just listed off here the NGSS standards: Life Science A, Middle School Life Science 1. Next is the instructional learning objectives, and here you have the first objective is that students will understand the relationship between conservation of mass, volume, and surface area. And then for this objective, here you have an informal assessment that students will do. They're going to answer questions in complete sentences in science notebooks, followed by a whole class debrief. And then the next one is that students will model chemical and mechanical breakdown of food using antacid, tablets, and vinegar. And the assessment for this is also informal. It's discussions in small groups, followed by whole class shareouts. And then here you have the students understand dependent and independent variables and elements of good experiment design. And for that, they're going to be doing an informal gallery walk of design, and as well as a formal, as a group, students submit design of experiment handout. Here they use their knowledge to design an experiment to test the effects of mechanical breakdown on the speed of chemical breakdown in the digestive system. And here they're using a formal summative where they work on a shared Google Doc that has all the details of their experiment. So next is the language function, which is how you were using language. And here is a keyword. Students will discuss in small groups using academic language. And here students will explain their use of good design components in experiment design Google Doc. And then they kind of just listed off the vocabulary and the additional language demands. These are all the vocab that students need. And then the discourse, the language demand is that students will have to demonstrate effective usage of this vocabulary in their conversations. Here they listed the resources and materials they need for the lab and for the activities. And then next is the prior knowledge. And so in the previous lessons, students learned about systems, and so they know about that. And they know that they're composed of different components and that they work together. They know about the digestive system and its components. They know from previous periods that the digestive system plays a role in breaking down food and absorption. They know that humans chew before they swallow. They're familiar with the vocabulary of dependent and independent variables, and they know about chemical reactions and know that if there are bubbles in a solution, a chemical reaction is taking place. Next is the transition from the previous activity. So the teacher basically walks around, talks about the activity from the previous day where the students created a model of the human body. And then the teacher shows students a model of the internal organs in a human torso. She makes a connection, or he or she makes a connection to the digestive system and parts of the digestive system created in clay by the students in the previous period. This way, there's really a connection between what they just had done in the previous activity and what they're going to do now. And then the hook and the purpose for learning, the teacher talks about the video on digestion that the students have watched for homework the night before. So the teacher assigned homework the night before, and then she talked about it in class. The teacher also shares a poem, and this gives a segue into talking about the digestive system. Next is the actual teaching, which is first the focused instruction, and this is where you model and how you teach your students. The teacher starts off by showing a diagram of the human digestive system and identifies the major organs and structures. Then she talks about the two types of breakdowns, mechanical and chemical, and explains that it's important for food to be broken down so they can be absorbed by the body. Then there's a warm-up activity, and kids work in groups of 4 students. After that, there's guided practice of modeling chemical and breakdown of answers to the table. And then the students read page B21 in the textbook as a class. And the teacher walks around the students through the teacher walks the students through templates provided for experiment design. So she's showing them how to use the template. Here you have the differentiating scaffolds, and this is how the teacher will use further support students, and she uses gestures and uses physical models when explaining concepts. Here's the guided instruction or practice, and this is basically the we do part. Students are shown a template on the document camera to copy into their science notebooks. They're given the materials they need for the lab. They follow directions, and then they discuss in their groups and they answer some questions. And this is the differentiating scaffolds. The whole class is provided with a template shown on the document camera to help students develop a model of chemical and mechanical breakdown. So they have this model up there that students are able to use. Teacher also walks around to support the students. and independent practice. Students work in small groups to design an experiment, and after that they get to do a gallery walk to look at the experiment designed by their peers and kind of have that discussion. And this is great because students are kind of going off on their own now, and doing their own thing, and they're able to master what they've just been taught. And the teacher is able to further support them by using the template provided for students, and it's designed to help them with students with IEPs to aid with the design process and help with organization. EL students and students who need extra help composing will automatically be aided by other team members, and so they're really able to help each other in the group setting, as well as all these other things. And so then closure, the teacher kind of sums up the importance of good experimental design practices and talks about what the students should have achieved on their design. She gives a brief summary of how the students will use the design to write detailed procedures and do the actual experiment in the next period. And so she's connecting what they did last time to what they did this time, and then what they'll be doing tomorrow, so the kids are aware of what they'll be doing. She also reminds them of the homework due next class.